Throughout history, civilizations have risen in regions where natural resources seemed abundant. Fertile soil, reliable water, and manageable climate allowed populations to grow and cities to flourish. But this abundance was never permanent. The relationship between human societies and their environment was always delicate, and when that balance shifted, even the most prosperous civilizations began to weaken. Environmental degradation rarely announces itself dramatically. It begins with subtle changes. Forests are cleared gradually to make room for agriculture. Rivers are diverted to irrigate expanding fields. Soil that once supported rich harvests slowly loses its nutrients. These changes happen over generations, and the people living through them often don't recognize the accumulating damage until it becomes difficult to reverse. Evidence from archaeological sites shows that many civilizations experienced environmental stress long before their decline became visible. Research points to patterns of deforestation, soil erosion, and water depletion in regions that once sustained large populations. Historians suggest that as resources became scarcer, agricultural yields declined. Food shortages didn't happen suddenly. They developed over decades, forcing communities to work harder for smaller harvests. When food production falters, the consequences ripple through every part of society. Trade networks that once moved surplus goods begin to contract. Cities that relied on imports from rural areas face shortages. Economic strain follows. Tax revenues decline because there is less wealth to collect. Governments struggle to fund infrastructure, defense, and public services. Institutions that once maintained order find themselves with fewer resources and less authority. Social tensions often increase during these periods. Competition for limited resources can fracture communities. Inequality may deepen as elites attempt to maintain their privileges while ordinary people face hardship. Administrative systems become more complex as authorities try to manage scarcity, but complexity itself can become a burden. The more rules and officials required to distribute diminishing resources, the less efficient the system becomes. Population dynamics shifted in response to these pressures. In some cases, growth slowed as malnutrition and disease became more common. Infant mortality rates likely increased when food security declined. Families may have chosen to have fewer children when prospects dimmed. In other instances, people migrated away from stressed regions, seeking better opportunities elsewhere. This movement could deplete the labor force needed to maintain agricultural systems, creating a feedback loop that accelerated decline. The loss of skilled workers had broader implications. Craftsmen, engineers, and administrators were essential to maintaining complex societies. When economic opportunities disappeared, these specialists sometimes left for more stable regions. The knowledge they carried, whether about irrigation engineering, metalworking, or administrative practices, could be lost to the communities they abandoned. This brain drain weakened institutional capacity precisely when adaptation was most needed. Trade relationships that once provided security through diversification became unreliable. Distant partners facing their own environmental or political challenges could no longer supply the materials societies had come to depend on. Bronze working civilizations required tin and copper from separate sources. When one supply chain broke down, entire industries could falter. The interconnectedness that had been a strength became a vulnerability. Religious and cultural practices sometimes hindered adaptation. Societies invested enormous resources in temple construction, ritual observances, and maintaining priestly classes. When environmental stress demanded practical responses, allocating labor and materials to ceremonial purposes could divert attention from urgent needs. Sacred landscapes might be preserved even when converting them to agriculture could have eased food shortages. Belief systems that attributed hardship to divine displeasure sometimes led communities to intensify traditional practices rather than seek new solutions. Written records from declining periods where they exist often reveal a gap between official accounts and lived reality. Inscriptions might proclaim abundance and divine favor, while archaeological evidence shows declining nutrition and abandoned settlements. This disconnect suggests that leadership either failed to recognize the severity of problems or chose to maintain appearances. Either way, the delay in acknowledging crisis limited opportunities for meaningful intervention. Adaptability becomes crucial during environmental decline, but it is not always present. Some societies attempt innovation. They develop new farming techniques, seek alternative water sources, or adjust their settlement patterns. Others remain locked into traditional practices, unable or unwilling to change course. Historical records suggest that civilizations with rigid hierarchies and centralized decision-making often struggled to respond quickly to environmental challenges. Climate variability added another layer of uncertainty. Periods of drought or unusual rainfall could devastate regions already under stress. Evidence indicates that even short-term climate shifts, lasting only a few decades, were enough to push vulnerable societies past a critical threshold. When crops failed repeatedly, populations sometimes migrated, abandoned settlements, or fragmented into smaller groups. The collapse of a civilization is rarely a single event. It is a process that unfolds across generations. Infrastructure deteriorates when there is no labor or funding to maintain it. Roads fall into disrepair. Irrigation systems break down. Buildings are abandoned. Knowledge and skills can be lost as institutions weaken and specialists disperse. What remains is often a smaller, simpler society that survives on a reduced scale. Environmental balance was critical because it underpinned everything else. Without stable access to water, soil, and other resources, populations could not sustain themselves. Economic systems depended on agricultural surplus. Political structures required the wealth that came from productive land. When that foundation eroded, the entire structure became fragile. Understanding these patterns requires caution. The archaeological record is incomplete, and interpretations vary. Historians debate the relative importance of environmental factors versus internal political or social dynamics. What remains clear is that environmental pressures were present in many cases of civilizational decline, often working alongside other stresses to weaken societies over time. The lesson from these historical examples is not that collapse is inevitable, but that resilience requires awareness. Societies that monitored their resource use, adapted to changing conditions, and maintained flexibility had better chances of enduring difficulties. Those that ignored environmental limits or failed to adjust faced gradual decline. In the end, civilizations did not fail because of a single catastrophic event. They declined because accumulated pressures, many of them environmental, eroded the systems that sustained them. The process was slow, often invisible to those living through it, and shaped by choices made across generations. What we learn from their experience is that balance, adaptability, and foresight matter deeply when resources are finite and conditions are uncertain.